Ein ganz schwieriges Thema meiner Meinung nach.
As we saw, when installing the Kontakt player, we have the option to use Kontakt with separate outputs. So at this point, it might be worth discussing why we would need individual outputs. We'll use a small example now to show you how to set up Kontakt to use the individual outputs. You don't need to use individual outputs when working internally within your DAW, but you may like the option to have individual instruments on their own mixer tracks in order to use specific high-quality plugins on specific instruments. You may also wish to route your individual instruments to an external mixing console, if need be. One thing I would suggest if you are working with a relatively small amount of instruments, for example, some strings, some brass and some percussion, if your computer is powerful enough, then load a new Kontakt player for each instrument required. This does require more processing power, but it means that each Kontakt player has its own mixer channel within your DAW. This goes for all DAW systems, and you may find that latency is improved by having a player for each instrument. This appears to be the case with Cubase and its ASIO drivers, or ASIO drivers. But any other DAW will use the same method that we are about to show. A small tip here. We don't actually need to use the Kontakt 5 option of 16 or 8 outputs, as we can specify the outputs to our own requirements directly from within our DAW. The next thing I need is some instruments, and so we'll drag some strings over to the player. I can minimize the screen by clicking on the C icon here. This, however, only works for Sono-Kinetics libraries, and most libraries work simply with the minus button over here on the right-hand side. But for this library, the C button works better. Now we'll add the woodwinds, and then the brass. And so now we have 3 instruments within one Kontakt player. The problem now is that I will only hear the instrument on channel 1, as my MIDI channel is set to 1. If I wish to hear the woodwinds, I need to change the MIDI channel setting to 2 in the drop-down menu. And now, if I change to MIDI channel 3, we can hear the brass instrument. Later on, we will create some individual MIDI tracks, but for now, I don't need to do so, as we are simply discussing the individual outputs. Up here in the Kontakt Player menu, we can select the Output button, and here below, we can see the default setup that the Kontakt Player displays. What I really want is for each instrument to have its own stereo output, and for the minute, we only have stereo 1 available. However, just above the outputs here, we have some batch configurations. And here, in the batch functions, we have the option to clear output section and create one individual channel for each loaded instrument. So I'll do this, and we can see that an individual channel strip has been made for each of our instruments. And now, if I play on the MIDI keyboard, we can see that the level meter is moving in the individual outputs. However, we cannot hear the second or third instruments yet. The reason for this is that I haven't activated any extra outputs in my DAW. By clicking here, I can activate the required outputs. You can and should rename the channels here. And now, when I play, we can hear the instrument on MIDI channel 2. And then the instrument on MIDI channel 3. If I add a 4th instrument by dragging and dropping, and then play the instrument back via MIDI channel 4, the problem occurs that it appears on output 1 automatically. The solution to this issue is to simply use the same batch function again, which resets the outputs and adds an output for each individual instrument. I will also have to activate the output in the Cubase mixer. And now we can see that instrument 4 is playing back on its own Cubase channel. So now I can add effects individually to each channel. Of course, it is also possible to add effects to instruments within the Kontakt player. For each channel, you can assign insert effects. But these effects are rather basic, and ultimately, I would consider using the effects that are available from within your DAW. The effects included in, for example, Logic, Cubase, Studio One, etc., are often of a higher quality. So my advice would be to use the Cubase channels to add effects where you can. Also, if you have third-party effects, you can use them to add to your instruments, as these are often of an even higher quality than the effects included within your DAW. The next issue we have is that all of our instruments are in one instance of the Kontakt player. What we need to do now, to allow us to play back all the instruments simultaneously, is to add individual MIDI channels for the instruments. In my case here, I need to add 3 extra MIDI channels. So I'll set MIDI 1 to channel 2, MIDI 2 to channel 3, and MIDI 3 to channel 4. The original Kontakt channel is controlling MIDI channel 1. So Kontakt 5 is playing the strings, MIDI 1 is playing the wind instruments, MIDI 2 is playing the brass, and MIDI 3 is playing the percussion. What I would suggest to do now is to name each channel with the instrument it is playing, and not only the MIDI track, but also the DAW mixer channels. It's very easy to lose track of what instruments are playing on which mixer channel, especially if your project grows and you are using individual tracks for individual instruments. One thing worth considering is creating a template with your favorite settings. The settings, for example, could be considered typical settings in your work, and by creating a template, the settings will always appear as they are now if you load that template. So that more or less covers individual outputs in the Kontakt player.